Hi, welcome to today's biocast. It's Professor Swanson again, and today we're going to look at Punnet Squares Part 2. In this biocast, we will take a look at Punnet Squares when we have two traits that we are looking at. So we're going to extend it beyond what we looked at in our first example. So let's get started. This time we're going to deal with two different traits. Again, a simple dominant recessive type of situation, and each time there will only be two different alleles. First thing we're going to do is look at the shape of the hairline. This is called a widow's peak, where the hairline comes down to a point in the middle. And this is called just a straight hairline, where it's just flat across your brow. The widow's peak is the dominant trait. So this individual could be homozygous for a capital P allele, or it could be heterozygous, having a capital P and a lowercase p. Since the straight hairline is recessive, this individual has to be lowercase p, lowercase p. So there's trait 1, presence or absence of the widow peak. The next thing we're going to look at is hair type. Is it curly or straight? So we can have curly or straight hair. Curly hair, we're going to represent with a C. Straight hair, we're going to represent with an S. Now, if you're a heterozygote, you're still going to have curls. It might not be quite as much, but they will still be there. So we're going to call this a CS individual. So our heterozygote is still going to have curly hair, just to maybe a slightly different degree, and curly, curly, and straight, straight. So we have our recessive genotype being straight hair, and our dominant genotype being curly hair. So let's start making a Punnet square with this system. What we really have here is two traits that function independently of each other. So what we really have is two simple Punnet squares we're going to put together. So we're going to take our female. Let's pretend that she's heterozygous for curly hair, and our male is also heterozygous for curly hair. Therefore, the two types of eggs she can produce will be a C egg and an S egg. The two types of sperm the male can produce will be a C sperm and an S sperm, so that the types of offspring that they can make will be curly, 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 and straight. And since they're both heterozygous, we see that it's that familiar 3-to-1 ratio. Our second trait we're dealing with is the widow's peak. So we'll make our female again heterozygous for the widow's peak. Since the dominant allele is for the presence, it means she will have a widow's peak. The male, we will also make heterozygous for the widow's peak. Two different types of eggs that the female can produce is one with the widow's peak and one with the allele for no widow's peak. The two sperm that the male can make, one for the widow's peak and a sperm with an allele for no widow's peak. If we allow these sperm and eggs to mix, we can see that we end up with, once again, our familiar 3-to-1 ratio of 3 individuals with the widow's peak and 1 without. So once again, we see a 3-to-1 ratio. Now what we want to do is combine these two to see what happens when we look at the two traits in conjunction. So let's set up our Punnet square. We're going to do it in the same fashion as we did before. Our female's eggs will be on the top, so it will represent the columns. The male's sperm will be on the side in the rows for our sperm. Now we have to take a look at what the genotype is of each one of these individuals. Our female, remember, is going to be heterozygous for curly hair and heterozygous for a widow's peak. Our male is also going to be heterozygous for curly hair and heterozygous for the widow's peak. Now all we have to do is try and determine what are the types of eggs that a female could make. Well, we always have to have one allele coming from the hair shape and one allele coming from the hair line. So for the first egg, let's take the first allele from the hair shape, which is curly hair, and the first allele from the hair line, which is a widow's peak. Now she could make a second egg, which would also have curly hair, but this time we have to take the second allele from the second trait, or in this case, the lowercase p, the recessive allele for the widow's peak. Now we've done all combinations with the first allele from the first trait. So now we have to go on to our second allele from that first trait, which is hair shape, which is for the female contributing an egg with straight hair and a widow's peak, or straight hair and no widow's peak. So we can see that when we have an individual who is heterozygous at two traits, there's 4 different types of gametes they could make. So our male is going to look exactly the same. So that means that we can have 16 different types of offspring being produced. So let's take a look at what those are. All we're going to do is we're going to blend each egg with each sperm. So this offspring would get the female's C, the male's C, the female's capital P, and the male's capital P. So this individual will be curly-haired with a widow's peak. This individual gets the capital C from the female, capital C from the male, a recessive P from the female, the dominant P from the male. So this one will also be curly-haired with a widow's peak. Now we look at the third type of egg that a female can produce. She gave straight hair, the male gave curly hair, the female gave a widow's peak, the male gave a widow's peak. So this individual will again be curly-haired with a widow's peak. The last type that we get from this row is the female gives a straight hair allele, male gives a curly hair allele, female gives no widow's peak, male gives a widow's peak, so we end up with curly haired and a widow's peak again. So we finished our first row of the Punnet square. Now, just to speed things up, we're just going to let the computer finish filling in everything else. In our next cell down, the female gives curly hair, male gives curly hair, female gives widow peak, male gives no widow peak, therefore it is curly hair and a widow's peak, curly hair, no widow's peak this time, so we're going to circle that one, curly hair, widow's peak, curly hair, no widow's peak. In our next row, what type of offspring will this individual be? Well, it'll be curly haired with a widow's peak, curly hair with a widow's peak, straight hair with a widow's peak. So notice this one is different again. So we're going to put a square around that one. And this one will be straight hair with a widow's peak. So that one also gets a square around it. In our last row, we have curly hair with a widow's peak. We have curly hair without a widow's peak. So that's going to get a circle. We have straight hair with a widow's peak. So that's going to get a box. And then lastly, we have straight hair and no widow's peak. This is a unique one. This one is all by itself, so it's the only one that doesn't have any markings in it. Now if we go through and count up how many of each type of offspring we have, everything that's underlined is an individual with curly hair and a widow's peak. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we have 9 offspring that have curly hair and a widow's peak. Now if we look at those with curly hair without a widow's peak, the ones with circles, we have 1, 2, 3 of those individuals. And individuals who have straight hair and a widow's peak, we also have 3 of those individuals. And then individuals who are recessive in both traits, straight hair without a widow's peak, we only have 1 of those individuals. So we can see that in this case, where we're looking at 2 traits with 2 alleles each, when we combine them, we end up with a 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 ratio. 9 individuals have both of their traits expressing the dominant trait. 3 individuals are dominant for the first trait, recessive for the second. 3 individuals are recessive for the first trait, dominant for the second, and 1 individual is recessive for both. So how did we get to that? Well, if you think about it, what we really did was we took a 3 to 1 ratio and another 3 to 1 ratio, and we just multiplied them together. And if we do simple FOIL, first outside, inside last, we get 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 1 is 3. 1 times 3 is 3. And 1 times 1 is 1. So that's where we get our 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 ratio. It's just simply multiplying the two 3 to 1 ratios together. All right, so hopefully you're understanding Punnett squares relatively well now. So now we're going to give you a little problem to try on your own here. We're going to see what would happen if these 2 individuals shown here were to reproduce and have some children. What's the probability of the hair type and the presence or absence of widow peak that they would have? First thing we have to do is figure out what their genotype is. The female here has straight hair, so she must be SS with respect to her hair type. She does have a widow's peak though, so she could be homozygous for the dominant one, or she could also be heterozygous with respect to the widow's peak. Now our male here has curly hair, so he could either be a CC or a CS individual. There's not really any widow's peak there, so that means that he must be homozygous for the recessive allele. Now we don't know which one of these they really are, but for your problem I want you to try, I want you to assume that the male is homozygous for curly hair and homozygous obviously for the absence of the widow peak, and I want you to assume that the female is homozygous for her straight hair obviously, but also homozygous for the presence of the widow's peak. So what you should do now is pause the recording and try and do this problem on your own. Okay, welcome back. Let's see how you did. First thing we need to do is take a look at our female and what are the different types of eggs that she could make. Well, she can either contribute a capital S or a capital S, and she can either contribute a capital P or a capital P. So you notice no matter what type of an egg she produces, she is always going to be creating an egg for straight hair with a widow's peak. The male is always going to be contributing a curly hair allele and the absence of a widow's peak. So his only type of sperm he can make is actually curly hair without a widow's peak. So if we think about it, this was kind of a trick question because our Punnett square is actually only one cell because the female can only give straight hair with the widow's peak. The male can only give curly hair without a widow's peak. So that means the only type of offspring that these two could have would be curly hair with the widow's peak. So I hope that helps you understand Punnet squares a little bit. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.